Hey guys, tonight we begin with the history of American football. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There is something sacred about the way autumn light falls across a football field in the late afternoon. The shadows grow long and purple, stretching like fingers across the carefully manicured grass, while the air carries that particular weight of seasonal change. Crisp and sharp, tinged with the smoke of distant fires and the promise of winter's approach. This is the theater where American football lives, where it has always lived, in the space between seasons, in the pause between summer's ending and winter's beginning. The grass beneath your feet tells its own story, each blade a witness to the countless cleats that have churned the earth, the bodies that have fallen, the dreams that have been born and shattered on these 100 sacred yards. The field itself is a canvas, painted weekly with fresh lines of lime that gleam white against the green, marking the boundaries of possibility, the incremental progress that defines not just the game, but perhaps the American experience itself. But to understand this game, to truly comprehend the mythology we have built around these 100 yards of grass and dirt, we must travel backward through time, beyond the bright lights and television cameras, beyond the roar of modern stadiums, to a place where the game was still finding its shape, still discovering what it might become. We must journey to the beginning, to those first tentative steps toward something that would eventually capture the soul of a nation. The story begins, as many American stories do, in the halls of ivy-covered institutions, where privilege and tradition walked hand in hand down cobblestone paths. It was November 6th, 1869, and the autumn air in New Brunswick, New Jersey, carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant promise of snow. On this particular Saturday, 25 young men from Rutgers University faced 25 from Princeton, gathering on a field that bore little resemblance to the carefully lined gridirons we know today. The morning had dawned gray and cold, with that peculiar quality of light that comes only in late autumn, when the sun hangs low and weak in the sky, casting everything in shades of amber and gold. The leaves crunched underfoot as the players made their way to the field, their breath visible in small puffs of vapor that disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. These were the sons of merchants and ministers, farmers and factory owners, young men who had been raised with the expectation that they would someday lead their communities, their states, perhaps even their nation. Picture, if you will, the scene. Young men in canvas pants and wool sweaters, their breath visible in the cooling air, their faces flushed with exertion and excitement. The field itself was nothing more than a patch of grass, unmarked except for the goals at either end. Not the elegant H-shaped posts we know today, but simple wooden uprights, standing like sentinels against the gray November sky. The rules were borrowed from rugby and soccer, a hybrid creation that spoke to America's tendency to take what it needed from the old world and reshape it into something entirely new. The spectators, perhaps 100 souls in all, stood along the sidelines without barriers or bleachers, their long coats and top hats creating a formal tableau against the informal chaos of the game itself. Women watched from beneath parasols despite the overcast sky, their long dresses rustling in the autumn breeze, while men consulted pocket watches and debated the finer points of rules that were still being invented as the game progressed. The game they played that day was chaos made manifest. 25 players on each side, moving in a great human swarm across the field, kicking and pushing and running with an intensity that spoke to something deeper than mere competition. They were creating something, though they could not have known it then. They were laying the first stones in a foundation that would eventually support a cathedral of sport and spectacle unlike anything the world had ever seen. The ball itself was a far cry from the precisely engineered footballs of today. It was rounder, more like a rugby ball, and it moved unpredictably when kicked, bouncing at odd angles that kept players constantly guessing. The leather was thick and heavy, darkened with use and weather, and it absorbed moisture from the damp grass until it became a sodden, unwieldy thing that required strength just to lift, let alone throw or kick with any accuracy. When the final whistle blew, if indeed there was a whistle, Rutgers had won by a score of 6-4. But the score was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the feeling in the air, the sense that something new had been born, something that would grow and change and eventually become as much a part of the American identity as the flag itself. The players shook hands in the gathering dusk, their faces dirty and their clothes torn, but their eyes bright with the knowledge that they had participated in something special, something that would be remembered long after they themselves had been forgotten. In the days that followed, word of the game spread through the network of universities and colleges that dotted the northeastern landscape. Harvard heard of it, as did Yale and Columbia, and each began to consider the possibility of forming their own teams, of testing their young men against their rivals in this new form of competition. The game was spreading, like ripples in a pond, each new team creating its own variations, its own interpretations of what this new sport might become. In those early days, the game was rough and formless, a violent ballet performed by young men who had not yet learned to fear injury, who threw themselves into the fray with the abandon of those who believe themselves immortal. The rules were fluid, changing from game to game, from school to school, as if the sport itself was still deciding what it wanted to become. There were no uniforms as we know them today, no padding, no helmets, just young men in their everyday clothes, testing themselves against each other in the dying light of autumn afternoons. The violence was immediate and visceral. Players would grab each other by the hair, by the clothes, by whatever they could get their hands on. There were no regulations about holding or interference, no concept of a fair catch or a safety. The game was pure struggle, man against man, will against will, played out on fields that were often little more than pastures borrowed for the occasion, marked only by the gouges left by desperate cleats and the patches of earth worn bare by countless collisions. But even in this primitive form, the game possessed a kind of primal beauty, a raw energy that spoke to something fundamental in the human spirit. There was something about the way the players moved in concert, the way they responded to each other's movements without conscious thought, the way they seemed to know instinctively where the ball would be and what they needed to do to get it. It was as if they were participating in some ancient ritual, some dance of competition that had been encoded in their DNA through generations of struggle and survival. The evolution was gradual, like watching a photograph develop in a darkroom. Walter Camp, a man whose name is whispered with reverence in the halls of football history, began to shape the game with the patience of a sculptor working marble. He was a Yale man, as so many of the early innovators were, and he understood that for the game to survive, it needed structure, rules, a sense of order that could contain its violent energy without destroying its essential spirit. Camp was a thin, serious man with penetrating eyes, and a mind that seemed to see patterns where others saw only chaos. He had played the game himself as a student, had felt the rush of competition and the satisfaction of victory, but he possessed something that many of his contemporaries lacked: the ability to step back from the immediate experience and see the larger possibilities. He understood that the game could be more than just a crude test of strength and endurance, that it could become a sophisticated blend of strategy and athleticism, intelligence and courage. His first major innovation was the concept of possession. In the early games, the ball was always in dispute, always being fought over by both teams simultaneously. Camp introduced the idea that one team would have clear possession of the ball and would have the opportunity to advance it toward the goal. This simple change transformed the game from a chaotic melee into something that resembled organized warfare, with clear offensive and defensive roles and the possibility of planned strategy. Camp introduced the concept of downs, that elegant solution to the problem of endless scrimmage. 3 attempts to advance the ball 5 yards, he decreed, or surrender possession to the other team. It was a stroke of genius, creating rhythm and tension where there had been only chaos. Suddenly, the game had a heartbeat, a pulse that matched the excitement of those watching from the sidelines. The down system created something that had never existed before in sport: the perfect marriage of time and space. Each play existed in its own discrete moment, with its own beginning and end, its own possibilities and limitations. The field became a chessboard, with each square of yardage representing a small victory or defeat. The game acquired a mathematical precision that appealed to the engineering minds of the era, while retaining the physical drama that made it compelling to watch. But Camp's greatest contribution was perhaps the most subtle. He reduced the number of players from 25 to 11, creating space on the field where there had been none. In that space, strategy could flourish. Plays could be designed, patterns could emerge, and the game could begin its transformation from pure physicality to something approaching art. The reduction in players had profound implications that extended far beyond the field itself. With fewer bodies in motion, individual skills became more important, more visible. A fast runner could now find daylight where before there had been only a wall of bodies. A skilled ball handler could demonstrate his abilities without being immediately swallowed by the crowd. The game became more about talent and less about sheer mass, more about intelligence and less about brute force. Camp also formalized the position of quarterback, creating the first true leadership role on the field. The quarterback would receive the ball from the center and decide what to do with it, whether to hand it to a running back, attempt a kick, or try to advance it himself. This position became the focal point of the team's strategy, the position through which all plays would flow. It was the beginning of the quarterback's evolution from mere participant to field general, from player to star. The 1880s and 1890s were the wilderness years, when football was still finding its identity. The game was brutal in ways that would make modern players blanch. There were no forward passes, no sophisticated blocking schemes, just raw power and determination. Players would lock arms and form flying wedges, human battering rams that crashed into the opposition with the force of runaway locomotives. The casualty lists read like war reports: broken bones, concussions, and worse. In 1905, 18 players died from injuries sustained on football fields across America. These were the years when the game earned its reputation for violence, when mothers would forbid their sons to play, and ministers would preach against the sport from their pulpits. The flying wedge, in particular, became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the game. Teams would line up in a V formation, with the ball carrier protected in the center, and then charges toward the opposing line with reckless abandon. The collisions were spectacular and often catastrophic, as bodies met with bone-jarring force and players were trampled underfoot in the resulting chaos. The uniforms of this era offered little protection from the violence. Players wore thin canvas pants that offered no padding, and jerseys that were often little more than heavy sweaters. Some players experimented with crude forms of protection: leather caps, padded vests, shin guards borrowed from soccer, but most relied on nothing more than their natural toughness and the hope that they would escape serious injury. The fields themselves were hazardous, often poorly maintained and littered with rocks, holes, and other obstacles that could turn a simple tackle into a trip to the hospital. There were no sideline barriers, no medical staff, no system for dealing with injuries beyond carrying the wounded player off the field and hoping for the best. Players were expected to tough it out, to play through pain and injury, to prove their manhood through their ability to endure punishment. But even in this primitive and dangerous form, the game was developing its own culture, its own mythology. Heroes emerged from the chaos, players whose names became legendary for their courage, their skill, or their ability to endure punishment. Stories were told and retold of great games and great players, of miraculous victories and heartbreaking defeats. The game was beginning to capture the imagination of the American public, to become more than just a college curiosity. The violence reached its peak in the early 1900s, when the game seemed to be spiraling out of control. Newspapers began calling for its abolition, and several prominent universities considered dropping the sport altogether. The game had become too dangerous, too unpredictable, too removed from the educational mission of the institutions that sponsored it. Something had to be done, or the game would die before it could truly live. It was this violence that nearly killed the game before it could truly live. President Theodore Roosevelt, a man who understood the value of both strength and restraint, summoned representatives from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton to the White House. The message was clear: reform the game or lose it forever. The threat was real, the consequences severe. Football stood at a crossroads, and the path it chose would determine not just its survival, but its character. Roosevelt was the perfect man to deliver this ultimatum. He was a former athlete himself, a man who understood the value of physical competition and the importance of testing oneself against worthy opponents. But he was also a progressive reformer who believed in the possibility of improving institutions through careful thought and decisive action. He saw football not as something to be destroyed, but as something to be perfected, to be made safer and more civilized while retaining its essential competitive spirit. The meeting in the White House was tense and formal, with the representatives of the three great universities sitting stiffly in their chairs while the president outlined his concerns. Roosevelt was direct and uncompromising. The game must be reformed, or it would be banned. The universities had the power to change the rules, to make the game safer, and if they did not exercise that power, others would exercise it for them. The choice was theirs, but the consequences would be America's. The reforms that followed were revolutionary. The forward pass was legalized in 1906, opening up the game like a flower blooming in fast forward. Suddenly, the air itself became part of the playing field. Quarterbacks could launch passes that arced across the sky like prayers, and receivers could run patterns that transformed the field into a canvas for athletic expression. The game became three-dimensional, vertical as well as horizontal, and in that expansion it found its poetry. The legalization of the forward pass was more than just a rule change. It was a fundamental reimagining of what the game could be. Before 1906, football had been a ground-bound sport, a game of inches and attrition where success was measured in yards gained through sheer force of will. The forward pass changed all of that, creating the possibility of long gains and spectacular plays that could change the outcome of a game in a single moment. The early forward passes were crude affairs, often little more than desperate heaves into crowds of players. The rules governing passing were restrictive. The ball had to be thrown from at least 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage, and it could only be caught by the ends on the offensive team. But even these limitations could not contain the possibilities that the forward pass created. Coaches began to experiment with different formations, different patterns, different ways of getting their receivers into the open field. The passing game evolved slowly, with each innovation building on the last. Coaches discovered that receivers could run precise patterns, that quarterbacks could learn to throw the ball with accuracy and timing, that the forward pass could be used not just as a desperation play, but as a regular part of the offensive strategy. The game was becoming more sophisticated, more complex, more interesting to watch and to play. But the forward pass was just one of many reforms that followed Roosevelt's intervention. The flying wedge was banned, replaced by formations that were less dangerous but no less strategic. The number of downs was increased from 3 to 4, giving teams more opportunities to advance the ball and reducing the pressure to gain yardage through dangerous mass plays. The neutral zone was established, creating a buffer between the offensive and defensive lines that reduced the violence of the initial collision. These changes transformed the game from a brutal test of endurance into something that resembled the sport we know today. The violence was still there. Football remained a contact sport, a collision sport. But it was contained within rules that made it safer and more strategic. The game became more about skill and less about brutality, more about intelligence and less about raw courage. The early decades of the 20th century saw football begin its migration from the exclusive domain of universities to something approaching a national obsession. High schools took up the game with the fervor of converts, and small towns across America began to organize around Friday night lights and Saturday afternoon games. The sport was democratizing, spreading beyond the ivy-covered walls of elite institutions to embrace anyone with the courage to strap on a leather helmet and step onto the field. This democratization was not without its controversies. The elite universities that had created the game were not always pleased to see it spreading to institutions they considered beneath their notice. There were debates about whether high school players were mature enough to handle the physical demands of the game, whether small towns had the resources to support teams, whether the game could maintain its character as it spread beyond its original boundaries. But the spread of football was unstoppable, driven by the same forces that were reshaping American society in the early 20th century. The country was becoming more urban, more industrial, more connected by railroads and telegraph lines. People were moving from farms to cities, from small towns to metropolises, and they were looking for new forms of entertainment, new ways to connect with their communities and their nation. Football provided exactly what these changing communities needed. It was a sport that could be played by anyone, regardless of background or social status. It required teamwork and cooperation, the very qualities that were needed in an increasingly complex society. It was exciting to watch, easy to understand, and deeply American in its values and its symbolism. The game was also evolving technically during these years. The equipment was improving, with better helmets and padding that offered more protection without sacrificing mobility. The rules were being refined, with clearer definitions of what was legal and what was not. The fields were being standardized, with consistent dimensions and markings that made it possible to compare teams from different regions. But perhaps most importantly, the game was developing its own professional class. Coaches who devoted their lives to understanding and teaching the sport. These men were part teacher, part military officer, part psychologist, responsible for molding young men into effective teams. They studied the game with the intensity of scholars, developing new strategies and tactics that pushed the boundaries of what was possible on the field. The coaching profession was attracting some of the finest minds of the era. Men who saw in football a laboratory for testing theories about leadership, motivation, and human performance. They were innovators and experimenters, constantly searching for new ways to gain an advantage over their opponents. The game was becoming more sophisticated, more strategic, more intellectually demanding even as it remained physically challenging. But it was the professional game that would ultimately capture the nation's imagination. The National Football League was born in 1920 in a Hupmobile dealership in Canton, Ohio, a humble beginning for what would become America's most popular sport. The early NFL was a rough-and-tumble affair, played in small cities and industrial towns by men who worked regular jobs during the week and transformed into gladiators on weekends. They played for small crowds and smaller paychecks, driven by little more than love of the game and the chance to test themselves against the best. The meeting in Canton was attended by representatives from 11 teams, most of them from the Midwest, all of them struggling to make professional football financially viable. The sport faced enormous challenges. It was competing with the established college game for attention and talent. It lacked the resources to promote itself effectively, and it was still struggling to overcome its reputation for violence and corruption. The men who gathered in that Canton dealership were not visionaries in the traditional sense. They were pragmatists, businessmen who saw an opportunity to make money from a sport that was already popular at the amateur level. They were not particularly well-funded or well-organized, and most of them had little experience in running a professional sports league. But they shared a common belief that professional football could succeed if it was properly organized and promoted. The early years of the NFL were marked by constant struggle and frequent failure. Teams folded with alarming regularity, and those that survived often did so by the narrowest of margins. The league championship was often decided as much by which teams could afford to finish the season as by which teams were actually the best. Players moved from team to team with bewildering frequency, often following whoever was willing to pay them the most. The game itself was still evolving, still finding its rhythm. It was a ground-based sport, methodical and grinding, where success was measured in yards gained and territory conquered. The forward pass was legal but rarely used, considered more of a desperation play than a legitimate strategy. Teams would pound the ball between the tackles, grinding out first downs like millers grinding grain, each play a small victory in a larger war of attrition. The players of this era were tough, blue-collar men who approached the game with the same intensity they brought to their factory jobs. They were not the polished athletes of today, but craftsmen who had learned their trade through years of hard work and painful experience. They played with crude equipment and primitive strategies, but they played with a passion and dedication that was undeniable. The crowds were small but enthusiastic, drawn by the promise of seeing the best players in the world compete against each other. The stadiums were often little more than high school fields with temporary bleachers, but the atmosphere was electric. The fans who attended these early games were true believers, people who understood that they were witnessing something special, something that would grow and evolve and eventually become a cornerstone of American culture. The league struggled in those early years, competing with college football for attention and respect. The college game had history and tradition on its side, as well as the natural loyalty of alumni and students. The professional game had only its quality of play, and even that was often questionable in the early years when teams were poorly organized and inadequately funded. But gradually, the professional game began to find its footing. The best college players began to see professional football as a viable career option, and the quality of play improved accordingly. The teams became more stable, more professional in their approach to the game. The rules were refined and standardized, making it easier for fans to follow and understand what was happening on the field. The breakthrough came in the 1930s, when the NFL began to establish itself as a legitimate alternative to the college game. The league was becoming more organized, more professional, more skilled at promoting itself and its stars. The games were becoming more exciting, more unpredictable, more worthy of the attention they were beginning to receive. But the real transformation was still to come. The game was about to enter a new era, one that would be defined not by the players or the coaches or even the owners, but by a new technology that would change everything about how Americans experienced sports. Television was coming, and with it, the modern era of professional football. Then came the 1950s, and with them, television. The marriage of football and television was one of those perfect unions that seems inevitable in retrospect, but was revolutionary at the time. The game, with its built-in breaks between plays and its dramatic structure of downs and yardage, was perfectly suited to the new medium. Television brought the game into living rooms across America, transforming it from a regional curiosity into a national phenomenon. The early television broadcasts were primitive by today's standards, with a single camera angle and minimal commentary. But they captured something essential about the game that radio had never been able to convey: the visual drama of the sport, the way the players moved in relation to each other, the sudden explosions of action that could change the outcome of a game in an instant. Television made football a visual experience, and in doing so, it made it accessible to millions of Americans who had never seen the game played live. The broadcasters of this era were pioneers, men who had to figure out how to translate the complexity of football into something that could be understood by viewers who might never have seen the game before. They had to explain the rules, describe the strategies, and create narratives that would keep viewers interested even when the action was slow or confusing. They were teachers as much as entertainers, and their work was crucial to the game's growing popularity. The technology was evolving rapidly, with new cameras, new angles, new ways of capturing the action. The instant replay was still years away, but the basic elements of televised football were being established: the play-by-play announcer, the color commentator, the between-plays analysis that helped viewers understand what they were seeing. The game was becoming more than just a sport. It was becoming entertainment, spectacle, a shared experience that brought families and communities together. The impact of television on the game itself was profound. Coaches began to think about how their strategies would look on camera, how their players would appear to the television audience. The game became more visual, more dramatic, more conscious of its appearance. The uniforms became more colorful, the stadiums more impressive, the presentation more polished. But perhaps most importantly, television created the possibility of national stars, players whose faces and names would be known from coast to coast. The game was no longer just a local or regional phenomenon, but a national one, with players who could become household names and teams that could develop followings thousands of miles from their home cities. The 1958 NFL championship game between the New York Giants and the Baltimore Colts is often called the greatest game ever played, though that title has more to do with its impact than its quality. It was the first NFL championship game to go to sudden death overtime, and it was broadcast live on national television to an audience of 45 million Americans. In the gathering darkness of Yankee Stadium, Johnny Unitas methodically drove the Colts down the field, each play unfolding with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. When Alan Amesh finally punched the ball across the goal line for the winning touchdown, he wasn't just scoring points. He was announcing the arrival of professional football as America's new national pastime. The game itself was a masterpiece of drama and suspense. The Giants, playing in their home stadium, had taken an early lead and seemed to be in control. But the Colts, led by the methodical genius of Johnny Unitas, had fought back to tie the game and force overtime. The tension was palpable, both in the stadium and in the millions of homes where Americans sat glued to their television sets, watching history unfold. Unitas was the perfect protagonist for this moment. He was a working-class hero from Pittsburgh, a man who had been cut by his hometown Steelers and had found his way to Baltimore through sheer determination and skill. He played the game with a calm precision that seemed almost supernatural, never appearing hurried or worried, even in the most pressure-packed situations. His passes floated through the air with impossible accuracy, finding receivers in the smallest of windows with a timing that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The overtime period was a clinic in quarterbacking, as Unitas methodically moved the Colts down the field with a series of perfectly executed plays. He mixed runs and passes, short gains and long strikes, keeping the Giants' defense off balance and the television audience on the edge of their seats. Each play brought the Colts closer to victory, and each play demonstrated why professional football was becoming America's favorite sport. When Amesh finally scored the winning touchdown, it was more than just the end of a game. It was the beginning of a new era, the moment when professional football announced itself as the equal of baseball, the moment when the NFL established itself as a major force in American sports. The game had been seen by more people than had ever watched a professional football game before. And those people had seen something special, something that would make them want to watch again. The impact of the 1958 championship game was immediate and profound. Television ratings for NFL games began to climb, and the league began to expand, adding new teams and new markets. The players became celebrities, their faces appearing on magazine covers and television shows. The game was no longer just a sport, but a cultural phenomenon, a shared experience that brought Americans together in ways that few other things could. The success of the 1958 championship game also demonstrated the power of television to create drama and build audiences. The game had been exciting and well played, but it had also been perfectly timed and perfectly presented. The overtime period had created suspense that could not have been scripted, and the television cameras had captured every moment of drama and excitement. The game had become must-see television, and in doing so, it had established a template for how sports could be presented on television. The 1960s brought revolution to the game, as they did to everything else in American life. The formation of the American Football League in 1960 created competition for the NFL, and competition bred innovation. The AFL was the younger, hungrier league, willing to experiment with new ideas and new ways of playing. They threw the ball more, scored more points, and played with a looseness that the staid NFL seemed to lack. The AFL games were more colorful, more exciting, more in tune with the changing times. The AFL was born out of frustration with the NFL's conservative approach to expansion and innovation. A group of wealthy businessmen, led by Lamar Hunt of Dallas, had tried to buy NFL franchises and had been rebuffed by the league's established owners. Rather than accept defeat, they decided to create their own league, one that would be more open to new ideas and new markets. The new league faced enormous challenges from the beginning. It had to compete with the NFL for players, coaches, and fans, and it had to do so without the NFL's established reputation and resources. The AFL owners were forced to be creative, to find new ways to attract attention and build audiences. They placed teams in cities that the NFL had ignored, they signed players that the NFL had overlooked, and they played a style of football that was more exciting and more television-friendly than the NFL's conservative approach. The AFL's greatest innovation was its approach to the passing game. While the NFL was still primarily a running league, the AFL embraced the forward pass as a primary weapon. AFL teams threw the ball more frequently, more creatively, and more successfully than their NFL counterparts. They developed new passing formations, new route combinations, and new ways of getting the ball to their receivers in space. The AFL's wide-open style of play was perfectly suited to television. The league's games were more exciting to watch, with higher scores and more dramatic plays. The AFL also understood the importance of marketing and promotion, creating colorful uniforms, dynamic logos, and memorable team names that helped build brand identity and fan loyalty. The competition between the two leagues was intense and often bitter. They competed for the same players, often bidding against each other in expensive signing wars that drove up salaries and created animosity between the leagues. They competed for the same television contracts, the same sponsors, and the same fans. The competition was good for the game, forcing both leagues to improve their product and their presentation. It was during this period that the game began to take on the shape we recognize today. The forward pass became not just legal, but central to the game's strategy. Quarterbacks like Johnny Unitas and Y.A. Tittle began to emerge as the game's first true stars. Their names known not just to football fans, but to the general public. The quarterback position was transforming from field general to something approaching celebrity, the focal point around which entire franchises would be built. The AFL also pioneered many of the innovations that would become standard in professional football. They were the first to use extensive television coverage to build their audience, the first to embrace the potential of the forward pass as a primary offensive weapon, and the first to understand the importance of marketing and promotion in building a successful sports league. The AFL's success forced the NFL to respond, and the response was swift and decisive. The older league began to adopt many of the AFL's innovations, throwing the ball more frequently, playing a more exciting style of football, and paying more attention to marketing and promotion. The competition between the two leagues raised the quality of play and the level of excitement, making professional football more popular than ever before. The rivalry between the leagues reached its peak in the mid-1960s, when the competition for players and fans was at its most intense. The AFL had established itself as a legitimate alternative to the NFL, and the NFL was forced to take the younger league seriously. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the future of professional football in America. The merger of the AFL and NFL in 1970 created the modern structure of professional football, but it was the championship game between the two leagues that truly captured the nation's attention. The first Super Bowl, played in 1967 between the Green Bay Packers and the Kansas City Chiefs, was a somewhat anticlimactic affair, with the Packers winning 35-10. But the concept was revolutionary. A single game to determine the champion of professional football, played on a stage grand enough to match the occasion. The idea of a championship game between the two leagues had been brewing for years, but it took the threat of continued competition and escalating costs to bring it to reality. The owners of both leagues realized that they were spending enormous sums competing against each other, and that a merger would be more profitable for everyone involved. But they also understood that the public wanted to see the best teams from both leagues play against each other, to determine once and for all which league was superior. The first Super Bowl was played in Los Angeles, in the cavernous Memorial Coliseum, and despite the enormous hype surrounding the game, it failed to sell out. The ticket prices were considered too high, and many fans were skeptical about whether the game would live up to its billing. The NFL was still considered the superior league, and many observers expected the Packers to win easily. The game itself was competitive for the first half, with the Chiefs staying close to the heavily favored Packers. But Green Bay's experience and talent eventually wore down the younger AFL team, and the Packers pulled away in the second half for a comfortable victory. The game was well played but not particularly exciting, and many observers wondered whether the Super Bowl would become an annual tradition or fade away as a failed experiment. But the concept was too powerful to fail. The Super Bowl represented something that American sports had never seen before. A single game that would determine the champion of an entire sport, played on a stage that was worthy of the occasion. The game was designed for television, with elaborate pre-game shows, halftime entertainment, and post-game analysis that turned the event into a full day of programming. The genius of the Super Bowl was in its timing. By 1967, television had become the dominant force in American entertainment, and football had become television's favorite sport. The Super Bowl was created for television, designed to be the ultimate television event. It was played on a Sunday in late January or early February, when the weather was cold and dark, and people were eager for something to bring them together. It became an unofficial national holiday, a day when America would gather around television sets to watch the best of the best compete for the ultimate prize. The early Super Bowls were dominated by the NFL, with teams like the Green Bay Packers and the Miami Dolphins establishing their superiority over their AFL counterparts. But, as the leagues merged and the talent became more evenly distributed, the games became more competitive and more exciting. The Super Bowl began to develop its own mythology, its own traditions, its own place in American culture. The game was also becoming more than just a football game. The halftime show evolved from simple marching band performances to elaborate spectacles featuring major entertainment stars. The commercials became as important as the game itself, with companies spending millions of dollars to create memorable advertisements that would be seen by the Super Bowl's massive audience. The game was becoming a cultural event, a shared experience that transcended sports and became a part of American life. But the true revolution came in the 1980s, when the game began to embrace entertainment as enthusiastically as it had embraced competition. The Super Bowl became not just a football game, but a cultural event, complete with elaborate halftime shows, expensive commercials, and enough pageantry to make the Romans jealous. The game was transforming from sport to spectacle, from competition to entertainment. This transformation was driven by several factors, not least of which was the continued growth of television and its influence on American culture. The Super Bowl had become television's most watched annual event, and the networks were willing to spend enormous sums to make it the most spectacular television program of the year. The game was no longer just about football. It was about creating an experience that would capture the attention of even the most casual fans. The halftime show became a showcase for the biggest names in entertainment, featuring performers like Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna, who brought their own massive followings to the game. These performances were elaborate productions that cost millions of dollars and took months to plan and rehearse. They transformed the Super Bowl from a football game with some entertainment into an entertainment spectacle that happened to include a football game. The commercials became events in themselves, with companies creating advertisements specifically for the Super Bowl that were designed to be talked about and remembered long after the game was over. The cost of a 30-second commercial during the Super Bowl rose to astronomical levels, but companies were willing to pay because they knew they would reach the largest audience in television. The commercials became so important that many people watched the game primarily to see the advertisements, and the day after the Super Bowl became an informal holiday devoted to discussing and ranking the previous night's commercials. This transformation was embodied by players like Joe Montana, who approached the game with the cool precision of a surgeon and the theatrical flair of a performer. Montana understood that football in the television age was as much about image as ability, as much about style as substance. He played the game with a calmness that seemed almost supernatural, never appearing hurried or worried, even in the most pressure-packed situations. His passes seemed to float through the air with impossible accuracy, finding receivers in the smallest of windows with a precision that bordered on the miraculous. Montana was the perfect quarterback for the television age. He was handsome and articulate, able to handle the pressure of media attention while maintaining his focus on the game itself. He understood that being a successful quarterback meant more than just throwing passes accurately. It meant being a leader, a spokesman, a symbol of excellence that fans could admire and emulate. Montana embraced this role completely, becoming not just a great player, but a cultural icon whose influence extended far beyond the football field. His partnership with Coach Bill Walsh revolutionized offensive football, introducing the West Coast offense that emphasized precision passing, timing, and intelligence over pure physical ability. Walsh understood that football was evolving into a more sophisticated game, one that required players who could think as well as perform, who could execute complex strategies under intense pressure. The West Coast offense was perfectly suited to television, with its emphasis on short, accurate passes that kept the ball moving and the action flowing. The San Francisco 49ers became the team of the 1980s under Walsh and Montana, winning 4 Super Bowl championships and establishing themselves as a dynasty that would be remembered long after their players had retired. They played a style of football that was both effective and entertaining, combining strategic sophistication with athletic brilliance in a way that made them must-see television. Their games were events, spectacles that drew enormous audiences and generated countless headlines. The 1980s also saw the rise of the modern coach as celebrity. Coaches like Bill Walsh, with his West Coast offense, and Mike Ditka, with his blue-collar Chicago Bears, became household names. They were no longer just tacticians, but personalities, their faces as familiar to American television viewers as those of movie stars or politicians. The game was becoming bigger than the game itself, expanding to fill whatever space was available in the American consciousness. These coaches understood that their role extended far beyond the sidelines. They were teachers and motivators, strategists and psychologists, public figures who were expected to represent their teams and their cities with dignity and intelligence. They became the faces of their franchises, the men who were ultimately responsible for success or failure, victory or defeat. The pressure was immense, but so were the rewards, both financial and cultural. The coaching profession was attracting some of the finest minds in America, men who saw in football a laboratory for testing theories about leadership, motivation, and human performance. They were students of the game who spent countless hours studying film, analyzing statistics, and developing new strategies that would give their teams an edge over their opponents. The game was becoming more intellectual, more complex, more demanding of both players and coaches. Mike Ditka's Chicago Bears represented a different approach to the game, one that emphasized toughness, physicality, and working-class values. The Bears of the 1980s were a throwback to an earlier era of football, a team that relied on crushing defense and punishing running attacks to overwhelm their opponents. But they were also perfectly suited to television, with colorful personalities, and a style of play that was both brutal and beautiful to watch. The Bears' defense, led by coordinator Buddy Ryan, was a work of art disguised as an instrument of destruction. The 46 defense was an aggressive, attacking scheme that put enormous pressure on opposing offenses while creating opportunities for spectacular plays. The defense was built around players like linebacker Mike Singletary, whose intensity and intelligence made him the emotional leader of the team, and defensive coordinator Buddy Ryan, whose innovative schemes confused and frustrated opposing coaches. The contrast between the 49ers and the Bears represented the range of possibilities that existed within professional football. The 49ers were precise and sophisticated, a team that won through intelligence and execution. The Bears were physical and emotional, a team that won through force of will and sheer talent. Both approaches were successful, both were entertaining, and both contributed to the growing popularity of the game. The 1990s brought the salary cap and free agency, fundamentally altering the business of football. Suddenly, teams could no longer simply buy championships through superior resources. The game became more democratic, more competitive, as talent was more evenly distributed across the league. This era saw the rise of the Dallas Cowboys as America's team, a marketing creation that spoke to the game's growing influence on American culture. The salary cap was implemented in 1994 as a way to control costs and create competitive balance throughout the league. Under the old system, wealthy teams could simply outspend their competitors for the best players, creating dynasties that were built on financial resources rather than organizational excellence. The salary cap leveled the playing field, forcing all teams to operate under the same financial constraints and making success dependent on smart management and good decision-making rather than deep pockets. Free agency allowed players to change teams when their contracts expired, creating a marketplace for talent that had never existed before. Players were no longer bound to the teams that drafted them for their entire careers, and they could choose to play for teams that offered the best combination of money, opportunity, and lifestyle. This created enormous opportunities for players, but also created new challenges for teams, who could no longer assume that their best players would remain with them indefinitely. The combination of the salary cap and free agency transformed the business of football, creating a more dynamic and unpredictable league where success was temporary and rebuilding was constant. Teams that had been successful one year might struggle the next, as their players left for other teams and their carefully constructed rosters were dismantled by the economic realities of the new system. The Dallas Cowboys of the 1990s were the perfect team for this new era. They were built through smart drafting, shrewd trading, and careful salary cap management, and they became a dynasty that won 3 Super Bowl championships in 4 years. The Cowboys were led by quarterback Troy Aikman, running back Emmitt Smith, and receiver Michael Irvin, 3 players who represented different aspects of football excellence, but who combined to form one of the most effective offensive units in NFL history. But the Cowboys were more than just a successful football team. They were a cultural phenomenon. Owner Jerry Jones understood that football was as much about entertainment as competition, and he marketed the Cowboys as America's team, a franchise that transcended regional loyalty and appealed to fans across the country. The Cowboys became a brand, a symbol of success and excellence that extended far beyond the football field. The Cowboys' success in the 1990s coincided with the NFL's emergence as America's most popular sport. The league had surpassed baseball in television ratings and cultural influence, and it was generating enormous revenues through television contracts, merchandise sales, and corporate sponsorships. The game was becoming big business, with billions of dollars at stake and thousands of jobs dependent on its continued success. But it was also during this period that the game began to grapple with its own violence in new ways. The gladiatorial aspect of football had always been part of its appeal, but as medical understanding of brain injuries advanced, the cost of that violence became harder to ignore. The game was forced to confront the reality that its players were paying a price that extended far beyond the final whistle, that the collisions that thrilled fans were causing damage that would last a lifetime. The first serious studies of football-related brain injuries began to emerge in the 1990s, as researchers started to unearth the long-term effects of repeated head trauma. The findings were disturbing. Players who had suffered multiple concussions were experiencing memory loss, depression, and other cognitive problems long after their playing careers had ended. The game that had brought so much joy to millions of fans was exacting a terrible toll on the men who played it. These discoveries forced the game to begin a long and difficult conversation about its own nature. Football had always been a violent sport, and that violence had always been part of its appeal. Fans came to see hard hits and spectacular collisions, and players took pride in their ability to deliver and absorb punishment. But the growing understanding of brain injuries raised serious questions about whether this violence was worth the cost, whether the entertainment value of the game justified the damage it was causing to the players. The league's initial response to these concerns was defensive and often dismissive. Team doctors and league officials questioned the research, downplayed the risks, and suggested that the studies were flawed or incomplete. The NFL spent millions of dollars on its own research, which often reached conclusions that were more favorable to the league's interests. The controversy simmered for years, creating tension between the league and the medical community, between players and owners, between the game's past and its future. But the evidence continued to mount, and the league was eventually forced to acknowledge that football could cause serious brain injuries. Rule changes were implemented to reduce the risk of head trauma, and new protocols were established for dealing with players who suffered concussions. The game began to evolve in response to these concerns, becoming somewhat less violent but no less competitive. The turn of the millennium brought new challenges and new opportunities. The game's popularity continued to grow, but so did questions about its place in American society. The NFL was generating billions of dollars in revenue. Its players were becoming household names, and its influence on American culture was undeniable. But there were also growing concerns about the long-term effects of playing the game, about the morality of watching young men damage their bodies for entertainment. The new millennium also brought new technology that changed how the game was played and watched. High-definition television made every detail of the game visible to viewers, while advances in camera technology allowed for new angles and perspectives that had never been possible before. The game became more visually spectacular, more immediate, more intimate for viewers who could see every expression on a player's face and every blade of grass on the field. The Internet created new ways for fans to engage with the game, from fantasy football leagues that allowed fans to become virtual coaches and general managers, to online communities where fans could discuss every aspect of their favorite teams. The game was becoming more interactive, more personal, more central to the daily lives of its fans. Social media transformed how players and fans communicated with each other, creating direct connections that had never existed before. Players could speak directly to their fans without going through traditional media, and fans could express their opinions and emotions in real time as games unfolded. The game was becoming more democratic, more participatory, more reflective of the broader changes that were taking place in American society. Tom Brady's arrival in New England in 2000 marked the beginning of a new era in professional football. Brady was different from the quarterbacks who had come before him, not necessarily more talented, but more intelligent, more adaptable, more willing to subordinate his individual glory to team success. His partnership with coach Bill Belichick created a dynasty that would dominate the game for the better part of 2 decades, winning 6 Super Bowl championships and redefining what it meant to be successful in professional football. Brady was an unlikely superstar, a player who had been drafted in the 6th round and was expected to spend his career as a backup quarterback. He was not the biggest, strongest, or fastest quarterback in the league, but he possessed something that was more valuable than pure physical ability: an unshakable will to win, and an almost supernatural ability to perform under pressure. Brady understood the game at a level that was rare even among professional athletes, and he used this understanding to maximize his own abilities and those of his teammates. The Brady-Belichick partnership was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence. Belichick was a defensive specialist who understood every aspect of the game, from the smallest details of individual technique to the broadest concepts of team strategy. He was a perfectionist who demanded nothing less than total commitment from his players, and he was willing to make difficult decisions if he believed they would help the team win. Together, Brady and Belichick created a culture of excellence that permeated every aspect of the New England Patriots organization. They were willing to trade popular players if they believed it would help the team, to change their strategy from game to game if the situation demanded it, to subordinate individual interests to team goals in ways that were unusual even in professional sports. The Patriots became a model of organizational excellence, a team that other franchises tried to emulate but could never quite duplicate. The Brady-Belichick era coincided with significant changes in how the game was played. The passing game became even more sophisticated, with receivers running precise routes and quarterbacks making split-second decisions based on what they saw in the defense. The game was becoming more cerebral, more strategic, though it remained fundamentally physical. Players were bigger, stronger, and faster than ever before, but they were also smarter, more skilled, more specialized. The Patriots' success was built on their ability to adapt to these changes, to find new ways to exploit the rules and the strategies that other teams were using. They were innovators who were constantly searching for small advantages that could make the difference between winning and losing. They understood that in a league where talent was increasingly evenly distributed, success would go to the teams that were smartest, most prepared, and most willing to evolve. The Patriots dynasty also coincided with the continued growth of the NFL as a cultural and economic force. The league was generating unprecedented revenues. Its players were becoming global celebrities, and its influence on American culture was reaching new heights. The Super Bowl had become the most watched television program of the year, and NFL games were consistently among the highest-rated programs on television. This period also saw the rise of fantasy football, which transformed how fans related to the game. Suddenly, fans weren't just rooting for their favorite teams, but were personally invested in the statistical performance of individual players. The game was becoming more personal, more intimate, as fans tracked every yard gained and every touchdown scored, as if their own fortunes depended on it. Fantasy football created a new type of fan, one who was interested in the game not just as entertainment, but as a form of competition. Fantasy players studied statistics, analyzed matchups, and made strategic decisions that mirrored those made by real coaches and general managers. The game was becoming more interactive, more participatory, more central to the social lives of millions of Americans. The rise of fantasy football also changed how the game was covered by the media. Television broadcasts began to include more statistics, more analysis of individual player performance, and more information that was relevant to fantasy players. The game was becoming more data-driven, more quantified, more susceptible to analysis and prediction. The 2010s brought the mobile quarterback revolution, led by players like Michael Vick, Colin Kaepernick, and later Lamar Jackson. These quarterbacks could run as well as they could throw, adding another dimension to the game, and forcing defenses to account for the possibility that the quarterback might take off running at any moment. The game was becoming more dynamic, more unpredictable, as traditional positions blurred and new strategies emerged. The mobile quarterback represented a fundamental change in how the position was understood and played. For decades, quarterbacks had been expected to stand in the pocket and deliver passes with precision and timing. They were field generals, strategists who used their intelligence and arm strength to dissect opposing defenses. But the new generation of quarterbacks brought athletic ability that had never been seen at the position before. Michael Vick was the pioneer of this new style of play. He possessed speed that rivaled that of the fastest running backs, and he could throw the ball with power and accuracy that matched the best pocket passers. When Vick took off running, he could turn a broken play into a spectacular gain, leaving defenders grasping at air as he sprinted past them. His style of play was thrilling to watch, and almost impossible to defend against. But Vick's career was also marked by controversy and inconsistency. His involvement in a dogfighting scandal resulted in a prison sentence that cost him several years of his prime, and he never quite reached the potential that his extraordinary athletic ability had promised. His career became a cautionary tale about the importance of character and decision-making, even for the most talented athletes. Colin Kaepernick represented the evolution of the mobile quarterback concept. He was bigger and stronger than Vick, with an arm that could deliver passes with stunning velocity and accuracy. Kaepernick led the San Francisco 49ers to a Super Bowl appearance and seemed destined for a long and successful career. But his decision to kneel during the national anthem to protest police brutality and racial inequality changed everything. Kaepernick's protest was simple but powerful. Instead of standing during the national anthem before games, he knelt quietly, using his platform as a professional athlete to draw attention to issues of social justice. The gesture was peaceful and respectful, but it sparked a firestorm of controversy that divided fans, players, and politicians. Kaepernick was using his celebrity to make a statement about issues that extended far beyond football, and the reaction was swift and polarized. But this decade also saw the game confront its demons more directly than ever before. The discovery of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, in the brains of former players cast a shadow over the sport that could not be ignored. The game was forced to acknowledge that its violence was not just entertainment, but was causing real, lasting damage to the men who played it. Rule changes were implemented to protect players, particularly quarterbacks and receivers, but the fundamental nature of the game, the controlled violence that made it so compelling, remained unchanged. The CTE crisis began with the work of Dr. Bennett Omalu, a pathologist who discovered evidence of brain damage in the autopsy of former Pittsburgh Steelers center Mike Webster. Webster had been a star player during the Steelers' championship years of the 1970s, but his life after football had been marked by mental illness, homelessness, and early death. Dr. Omalu's findings suggested that Webster's problems were directly related to the repeated head trauma he had suffered during his playing career. The discovery of CTE in Webster's brain was just the beginning. As more former players died and their brains were examined, the evidence mounted that football was causing widespread brain damage. Players who had been heroes on the field were suffering from depression, dementia, and other cognitive problems that seemed to be directly related to their football careers. The game that had brought them fame and fortune was destroying their minds and their lives. The NFL's response to the CTE crisis was slow and defensive. The league questioned the research, funded its own studies that reached different conclusions, and generally tried to minimize the significance of the findings. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the league was eventually forced to acknowledge that football could cause brain damage. The admission came only after years of denial and obfuscation, and it damaged the league's credibility with players, fans, and the medical community. The CTE crisis forced the game to confront fundamental questions about its own nature. Football had always been a violent sport, and that violence had always been part of its appeal. But if that violence was causing permanent brain damage, was the game still worth playing? Was it ethical to watch young men destroy their minds for entertainment? These were questions that had no easy answers, and they continued to haunt the game as it struggled to balance safety with tradition. Rule changes were implemented to make the game safer, but they were often controversial and difficult to enforce. Penalties for hits to the head were increased, protocols for dealing with concussions were strengthened, and equipment was improved to provide better protection. But the fundamental nature of the game remained unchanged. It was still a collision sport, and collisions would always carry the risk of injury. The Kaepernick protests of 2016 brought politics into the game in a way that made many fans uncomfortable. When the San Francisco 49ers quarterback began kneeling during the national anthem to protest police brutality and racial inequality, he was making a statement about more than football. He was using the platform that the game had given him to speak about issues that mattered to him. And in doing so, he was forcing the game to confront its own relationship with American society. The protests divided fans and players, owners and coaches, in ways that revealed the complex role that football plays in American life. For some, the game was a refuge from politics, a place where they could escape the divisions and controversies of everyday life. For others, the game was too important, too central to American culture, to remain silent on issues of social justice. The controversy eventually cost Kaepernick his career, but it also forced the game to examine its own values and its responsibility to the broader society it served. Kaepernick's protest was rooted in a long history of athlete activism, from Muhammad Ali's opposition to the Vietnam War to Jackie Robinson's breaking of baseball's color barrier. But the reaction to Kaepernick's protest was particularly intense, perhaps because it challenged some of the fundamental myths that Americans tell themselves about their country and their values. The national anthem and the flag are powerful symbols, and Kaepernick's decision to kneel during the anthem was seen by many as an attack on those symbols and the values they represent. The controversy revealed deep divisions within American society, divisions that extended far beyond football. Some saw Kaepernick as a hero, a man who was willing to sacrifice his career to draw attention to important social issues. Others saw him as unpatriotic, a privileged athlete who was disrespecting the country that had given him so much. The debate raged for years, involving everyone from fans and players to politicians and celebrities. The NFL's handling of the controversy was widely criticized as inconsistent and tone-deaf. The league initially tried to remain neutral, but it eventually implemented a policy requiring players to stand during the national anthem or remain in the locker room. The policy was later rescinded, but the damage was done. The league had alienated both those who supported Kaepernick's message and those who opposed his method of protest. The controversy also highlighted the complex relationship between the NFL and its predominantly African American player base. Many players supported Kaepernick's message, even if they disagreed with his method of protest. They understood that he was trying to draw attention to issues that affected their communities, and they were frustrated by the league's apparent unwillingness to support him or engage seriously with the issues he was raising. The arrival of Patrick Mahomes in Kansas City marked the beginning of what many consider the modern era of football. Mahomes brought a combination of arm strength, mobility, and creativity that seemed to expand the very definition of what was possible on a football field. His passes didn't just travel through the air, They seemed to defy physics, curving and dipping and finding receivers in places that seemed impossible. He could throw the ball sidearm, underhand, or while falling backward, and somehow it would still find its target with pinpoint accuracy. Mahomes represented the evolution of the quarterback position to its logical extreme. He was not just a thrower of passes, but a creator of magic, capable of turning broken plays into touchdowns and impossible situations into victories. His success led to a new emphasis on quarterback mobility and arm talent, as teams began to prioritize athletic ability over traditional pocket presence. Mahomes's style of play was perfectly suited to the modern era of football, where defenses were faster and more sophisticated than ever before. Traditional pocket passers were finding it increasingly difficult to operate in the face of these improved defenses, but Mahomes could extend plays with his mobility, creating new opportunities for his receivers and making defenders miss in ways that seemed to violate the laws of physics. His arm strength was legendary, enabling him to make throws that other quarterbacks couldn't even attempt. He could throw the ball 60 yards with perfect accuracy, or deliver a 20-yard pass with such velocity that it reached the receiver before the defender could react. His release was so quick that he could get the ball out even when he was under intense pressure, and his accuracy was so precise that he could hit receivers in stride even when they were running at full speed. But perhaps most importantly, Mahomes possessed an improvisational ability that was rare even among elite athletes. When plays broke down, when the carefully scripted strategies of his coaches failed, Mahomes could create something new, something unexpected, something that turned disaster into triumph. He played the game with a creativity and spontaneity that was reminiscent of jazz musicians, finding new melodies in the chaos and turning them into beautiful music. The Kansas City Chiefs became the team of the late 2000s and teens and early 2000s and 20s under Mahomes's leadership, winning multiple championships and establishing themselves as a dynasty built around the quarterback's extraordinary abilities. They played a style of football that was both explosive and efficient, capable of scoring from anywhere on the field at any time. Their games were spectacles, showcases for Mahomes's talent and the innovative offensive system that Coach Andy Reid had built around him. Reid was the perfect coach for Mahomes, a veteran offensive mind who understood how to maximize the quarterback's unique abilities while minimizing his weaknesses. Reid had spent decades studying the game, developing an offensive system that was both complex and flexible, capable of adapting to whatever the defense presented. He understood that Mahomes's talents were extraordinary, and he built an entire offensive philosophy around allowing the quarterback to express those talents within a structured system. The 2020s have brought new challenges and new opportunities. The COVID-19 pandemic forced the game to adapt in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. Games were played in empty stadiums, with crowd noise piped in through speakers and cardboard cutouts in the seats. The game persevered, but it was different, quieter, more intimate in some ways, but also more sterile. The pandemic fundamentally changed how fans experienced the game, forcing them to rely entirely on television broadcasts without the possibility of attending games in person. The empty stadiums created an eerie atmosphere that was unlike anything in the game's history. The sounds of the game, the quarterback's audibles, the collision of pads, the coach's instructions, became audible in ways they had never been before, creating a strange intimacy between viewers and the action on the field. The financial impact of the pandemic was enormous, as teams lost hundreds of millions of dollars in ticket revenue, concessions, and other stadium-related income. The NFL was forced to revise its salary cap projections, and teams had to make difficult decisions about player personnel and facility improvements. The pandemic demonstrated just how dependent the game had become on the live fan experience, even as television remained its primary revenue driver. The pandemic also accelerated changes that were already underway. The game became even more dependent on television and streaming revenue, even more focused on the home viewing experience. The stadium experience, once central to the game's appeal, became secondary to the broadcast, as more and more fans chose to watch from home rather than attend in person. But perhaps the most significant change has been the game's embrace of technology and analytics. Every play is now analyzed from multiple angles, every movement tracked and measured and compared to historical data. Coaches have access to information that would have been unimaginable to their predecessors, and they use this information to make decisions that once would have been based purely on intuition and experience. The revolution in analytics has transformed every aspect of the game, from how players are evaluated and acquired to how strategies are developed and implemented. Teams now employ armies of data scientists and statisticians who analyze everything from the optimal play call on third down to the most effective way to arrange players in the huddle. The game has become more quantified, more predictable, more susceptible to mathematical analysis. This analytical approach has led to some surprising discoveries that have challenged conventional wisdom about the game. For example, analytics have shown that teams should attempt more fourth down conversions than they traditionally have, that the optimal strategy on certain downs and distances is counterintuitive, and that some players who were considered stars based on traditional statistics were actually less valuable than previously thought. The use of analytics has also extended to player health and performance, with teams using wearable sensors and other technology to monitor everything from a player's heart rate during practice to his sleep patterns during the off-season. This information is used to optimize training programs, prevent injuries, and maximize performance in ways that were never possible before. The game has also become more global, with regular season games played in London and Mexico City, and plans for further international expansion. The NFL is no longer content to be America's game. It wants to be the world's game, to export its unique brand of controlled violence and strategic complexity to markets around the globe. The international expansion of the NFL represents a significant shift in the league's ambitions and priorities. For decades, the game was purely American, a sport that was played and watched almost exclusively in the United States. But the league has recognized that there are enormous opportunities for growth in international markets, particularly as traditional American markets become saturated. The games played in London have been particularly successful, drawing large crowds and generating significant interest from British fans who are being exposed to American football for the first time. The NFL has invested heavily in developing the game in the United Kingdom, creating youth programs, supporting local teams, and building relationships with British media organizations. The expansion into Mexico has been equally promising, with games in Mexico City drawing massive crowds and enormous television audiences. The Mexican market is particularly attractive to the NFL because of the large Mexican-American population in the United States, and the potential for creating a truly North American fan base that transcends national boundaries. But international expansion also presents significant challenges. The game must be adapted to different cultures and different expectations, and the NFL must compete with soccer and other sports that already have established followings in these markets. The time difference makes it difficult to schedule games that are convenient for both American and international audiences, and the logistics of moving teams and equipment across oceans are complex and expensive. As we look toward the future, the game continues to evolve. The next generation of quarterbacks, led by players like Josh Allen and Justin Herbert, combines the mobility of the previous generation with even stronger arms and more sophisticated understanding of the game. The passing game continues to become more complex, with receivers running routes that would have been impossible to execute even a decade ago. Josh Allen represents the physical evolution of the quarterback position. He stands 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighs 240 pounds, with an arm that can deliver passes with stunning velocity and accuracy. He can throw the ball 70 yards with apparent ease, and he can run through defenders with the power of a fullback. Allen combines the physical gifts of a linebacker with the touch and timing of a surgeon, creating a combination that is almost impossible to defend against. Justin Herbert represents the intellectual evolution of the position. He came to the NFL with a sophisticated understanding of complex offensive systems, and he has demonstrated an ability to read defenses and make quick decisions that is rare even among veteran quarterbacks. Herbert processes information with computer-like efficiency, seeing patterns and opportunities that other players miss entirely. The running game, long thought to be dying, has experienced a renaissance as teams have realized that in an era of sophisticated passing defenses, the ability to run the ball effectively can provide a crucial advantage. Running backs like Derrick Henry and Nick Chubb have shown that power and speed can still be effective weapons, even in an increasingly complex game. Derrick Henry is a throwback to an earlier era of football, a massive runner who combines size, speed, and power in ways that seem to violate the basic principles of physics. He stands 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighs 247 pounds, but he can run 40 yards in 4.5 seconds and break tackles with the force of a collision between freight trains. When Henry gets into the open field, he is virtually unstoppable, capable of running over defenders or around them with equal effectiveness. Nick Chubb represents a different approach to the running game, combining vision, patience, and burst in ways that make him one of the most effective runners in the game. Chubb has an almost supernatural ability to see holes in the defense before they fully develop, and he can accelerate through those holes with a suddenness that leaves defenders grasping at air. His style is more subtle than Henry's, but no less effective. The resurgence of the running game has been driven partly by the realization that modern defenses are designed primarily to stop the pass, often leaving them vulnerable to well-designed running plays. Teams that can establish an effective ground game can control the tempo of the game, wear down opposing defenses, and create opportunities for explosive plays in the passing game. The defensive side of the ball has also evolved, with players becoming more versatile and schemes becoming more complex. The traditional divisions between linebackers and defensive backs have blurred, as teams use hybrid players who can cover receivers one moment and rush the passer the next. The defense has become more athletic, more mobile, more capable of adapting to whatever the offense presents. Modern defenses are built around speed and versatility, with players who can change roles and responsibilities from play to play. Linebackers who can cover receivers in space, defensive backs who can blitz the quarterback, and defensive linemen who can drop into coverage are all part of the modern defensive toolkit. The defense has become more unpredictable, more aggressive, more willing to take risks in pursuit of game-changing plays. The evolution of defensive schemes has been driven by the need to counter increasingly sophisticated offensive strategies. As offenses have become more complex and more explosive, defenses have been forced to respond with their own innovations and adaptations. The result is a constant arms race between offense and defense, with each side constantly searching for new ways to gain an advantage over the other. But for all its evolution, for all its technological sophistication and global ambitions, football remains fundamentally what it has always been: a test of will and skill, courage and intelligence, played out on a field that serves as a metaphor for life itself. The game is still about advancing toward a goal, about overcoming obstacles, about working together toward a common objective. It is still about the collision of bodies and the clash of wills, about the moment when everything is on the line, and only one team can emerge victorious. The field itself remains unchanged, 100 yards long and 53 yards wide, with goalposts at either end standing like sentinels against the sky. The basic objective remains the same: advance the ball down the field and score more points than the other team. But within that simple framework, infinite complexity has emerged. Strategies and counter-strategies that would impress military generals and tactics that would confuse chess grandmasters. The game has become a mirror of American society itself, reflecting our values and our contradictions, our aspirations and our fears. It celebrates violence while preaching teamwork, emphasizes individual achievement while demanding collective effort, promotes equality while maintaining hierarchies. It is a game that rewards both intelligence and brute force, both careful planning and split-second decision-making, both conformity and creativity. The players themselves have become larger than life, modern gladiators who command salaries that would have been unimaginable to their predecessors. They are celebrities and role models, entertainers and athletes, symbols of success and examples of dedication. Their names are known by millions, their statistics memorized by fans who have never met them but feel a deep personal connection to their success or failure. These modern players are different from their predecessors in almost every way. They are bigger, stronger, faster, and more skilled than any generation that came before them. They train year-round with scientific precision, following carefully designed programs that optimize every aspect of their physical and mental performance. They eat precisely calculated diets, sleep according to carefully monitored schedules, and recover using techniques that would have seemed like science fiction to the leather-helmeted pioneers of the early game. The modern NFL player is a carefully crafted athlete, shaped by years of specialized training and scientific understanding of human performance. His body is a precision instrument, calibrated for maximum efficiency and power. His mind is equally developed, trained to process complex information at lightning speed and make split-second decisions under intense pressure. He is part warrior, part chess player, part entertainer, part businessman. The financial rewards available to today's players would have been unimaginable to their predecessors. The average NFL salary now exceeds $3 million per year, and the top players earn tens of millions annually through contracts, endorsements, and other business ventures. These players are not just athletes, but brands, carefully managed entities that exist as much in the realm of marketing and media as they do on the football field. But with these rewards come pressures and expectations that previous generations never faced. Modern players live under constant scrutiny, their every move monitored by cameras, microphones, and social media. They are expected to be role models and spokesmen, to represent not just their teams, but their communities and their sport. The pressure is immense, and not all players are equipped to handle it successfully. The coaches have become generals in this war of attrition, developing strategies that would impress military strategists and managing personalities that would challenge the most skilled executives. They are teachers and motivators, tacticians and psychologists, responsible for molding dozens of individual talents into a single, cohesive unit, capable of executing complex plans under intense pressure. Modern coaches are part scientist, part artist, part therapist. They must understand not just the X's and O's of football strategy, but also the psychology of motivation, the dynamics of team chemistry, and the business realities of professional sports. They work with enormous budgets and face enormous pressure to produce immediate results. Their careers can be made or destroyed by a single season, a single game, even a single play. The coaching staffs of modern NFL teams are massive organizations that would rival small corporations in their complexity and scope. A typical team employs dozens of coaches, each with specialized responsibilities ranging from position-specific instruction to advanced scouting to analytics. These coaches work year-round, studying film, analyzing data, and developing strategies that might provide even the smallest competitive advantage. The relationship between coaches and players has evolved significantly over the decades. The autocratic coaches of earlier eras, who ruled through fear and intimidation, have largely given way to more collaborative approaches that emphasize communication, understanding, and mutual respect. Modern players are more educated, more aware of their rights and options, and less willing to accept treatment that they consider unfair or abusive. But the fundamental challenge of coaching remains unchanged: how to get a group of individuals to work together toward a common goal, how to maximize the talents of each player while minimizing their weaknesses, how to prepare a team to perform at its highest level when everything is on the line. The best coaches are masters of human psychology as much as football strategy, able to push the right buttons at the right times to inspire their players to achieve things they never thought possible. The fans have become participants in the spectacle, their cheers and jeers as much a part of the game as the blocking and tackling. They paint their faces and wear their team's colors, travel hundreds of miles to attend games, and organize their lives around the weekly rhythm of the season. They are customers and patrons, critics and supporters, the ultimate arbiters of the game's success or failure. The modern NFL fan is a complex creature, one whose relationship with the game extends far beyond simple entertainment. Many fans invest enormous amounts of time, money, and emotional energy in following their teams. They study statistics, analyze draft picks, debate coaching decisions, and argue endlessly about which players are better, which teams are stronger, which strategies are most effective. Fantasy football has transformed many fans from passive observers into active participants, giving them a personal stake in the performance of individual players regardless of which teams they play for. Fantasy players study the game with the intensity of coaches, analyzing matchups, weather conditions, injury reports, and countless other factors that might affect player performance. They make roster decisions, negotiate trades, and compete against friends and strangers in leagues that can span continents. The fan experience has been revolutionized by technology, with apps that provide real-time statistics, social media platforms that enable instant communication with other fans, and streaming services that allow fans to watch games from anywhere in the world. The modern fan is more connected to the game than ever before, but also more demanding, expecting constant access to information, analysis, and entertainment. The relationship between fans and players has become more complex and more intimate through social media. Fans can follow their favorite players' daily lives, see their families, understand their personalities, and feel a personal connection that was impossible in earlier eras. But this intimacy can also breed unrealistic expectations and inappropriate behavior, as some fans feel entitled to comment on every aspect of a player's life. The media has become an integral part of the game's ecosystem, analyzing every play and every decision, creating narratives that give meaning to the chaos of competition. They are storytellers and historians, critics and cheerleaders, responsible for translating the complexity of the game into something that can be understood and appreciated by the general public. The modern sports media landscape is vastly different from what existed even a generation ago. The traditional model of newspapers, magazines, and television has been supplemented and, in many cases, replaced by digital platforms, podcasts, social media influencers, and other new forms of content creation. The barriers to entry have been lowered dramatically, allowing anyone with a camera and an internet connection to become a football analyst or commentator. This democratization of media has brought both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, it has created space for more diverse voices, more specialized coverage, and more immediate analysis. Fans can now find content that caters to their specific interests, whether that's detailed statistical analysis, locker room gossip, or historical perspective. On the other hand, the proliferation of sources has made it more difficult to distinguish between reliable journalism and uninformed opinion, between factual reporting and deliberate misinformation. The traditional sports media still plays an important role, particularly in providing the resources and credibility necessary for serious investigative reporting. The major networks and publications have the budgets to send reporters to training camps, press conferences, and games, and they have the institutional reputation necessary to gain access to players, coaches, and team officials. But they must now compete for attention with countless other sources, forcing them to be more creative, more immediate, and more engaging than ever before. The coverage of football has become incredibly sophisticated, with advanced statistics, detailed analysis of strategy and tactics, and comprehensive examination of every aspect of the game. Modern broadcasts include multiple camera angles, instant replay from dozens of perspectives, and commentary from former players and coaches who can provide insights that would have been impossible to obtain in earlier eras. The viewer today has access to more information about the game than the coaches and players had just a few decades ago. The business of football has become a massive industry, generating billions of dollars in revenue and supporting thousands of jobs. It is television programming and marketing opportunity, merchandise sales and stadium construction, an economic engine that powers entire communities and influences the decisions of corporate boardrooms around the world. The NFL is now one of the most valuable sports leagues in the world, with annual revenues exceeding $15 billion. The individual franchises are worth billions of dollars each, making their owners some of the wealthiest people in America. The league's television contracts alone are worth more than $100 billion over the next decade, providing a stable foundation for continued growth and expansion. This enormous financial success has transformed the game in ways that extend far beyond the field. Teams now employ hundreds of people in roles that didn't exist a generation ago. Data analysts, social media managers, fan experience coordinators, and countless others who work to maximize revenue and enhance the fan experience. The game has become a sophisticated business operation that happens to involve athletic competition. The economic impact of football extends far beyond the teams and the league itself. Every NFL city benefits from the presence of a team, with games generating millions of dollars in hotel bookings, restaurant visits, and other economic activity. The construction of new stadiums creates thousands of jobs and often serves as a catalyst for broader urban development. The game has become an important economic driver for communities across America. But this financial success has also created new pressures and challenges. The enormous amounts of money involved have raised the stakes for everyone involved, creating pressure for immediate success that can lead to poor decision-making and short-term thinking. The business side of the game sometimes conflicts with the competitive side, as teams balance the desire to win with the need to generate revenue and control costs. The relationship between the league and its players has become increasingly complex as the financial stakes have risen. The players' union has become more sophisticated and more aggressive in pursuing its members' interests, leading to several work stoppages and ongoing tensions over issues like player safety, revenue sharing, and disciplinary procedures. The players are more aware of their economic value and more willing to fight for their share of the game's enormous revenues. But beneath all the money and media attention, beneath the celebrity and spectacle, the game remains what it has always been: a simple test of human will and ability, played out on a field that serves as a stage for the eternal drama of competition. It is still about the moment when the ball is snapped, and 22 men collide with the fury of gladiators, when strategy becomes instinct and planning becomes improvisation, when the carefully constructed plays of the coaches become the spontaneous reactions of the players. In that moment of collision, when bodies meet with bone-jarring force and the carefully laid plans of coaches meet the unpredictable reality of human performance, something magical happens. Time seems to slow down, and the chaos of 22 men moving at full speed somehow resolves into patterns of beauty and meaning. The game becomes poetry written in motion, drama enacted through competition, art created through struggle. The snap of the ball is like the first note of a symphony, setting in motion a complex composition that will unfold over the next few seconds with mathematical precision and artistic flair. Each player has his role to play, his part in the larger performance, but the outcome is never certain until the final whistle blows. The game exists in the tension between order and chaos, between planning and improvisation, between individual brilliance and collective effort. The quarterback takes the snap and begins his dance with destiny, reading the defense, processing information, making decisions that will determine success or failure. His teammates run their routes with precision, each step carefully choreographed but ready to adapt if the situation demands it. The defense responds with its own complex choreography, 22 men moving in intricate patterns that have been practiced thousands of times but never performed in exactly this way. The collision is inevitable and sudden, bodies meeting with force that would shatter normal human beings, but which these gladiators absorb and continue. The ball flies through the air like a prayer, its trajectory determined by physics, but its destination dependent on the skill and determination of the men pursuing it. Time expands and contracts, seconds feeling like hours and hours like seconds, as the play unfolds with the inexorable logic of fate. The game continues to evolve, continues to adapt to new challenges and new opportunities. The players become faster and stronger, the strategies more sophisticated, the technology more advanced. But the fundamental appeal remains unchanged. The drama of competition, the beauty of athleticism, the thrill of victory, and the agony of defeat. Each new season brings new possibilities, new heroes, new stories to be told and retold around water coolers and dinner tables across America. The rookies arrive with dreams of glory and visions of championship rings, while the veterans fight to extend careers that they know cannot last forever. The coaches develop new strategies, the fans make new predictions, and the media creates new narratives to explain and explore the endless fascination of the game. The draft each spring has become an event in itself, a celebration of possibility and potential that captures the imagination of fans who see in these young men the future of their teams and their dreams. The college players who have devoted their lives to reaching this moment walk across the stage to shake the commissioner's hand, knowing that they are stepping into a new world where the stakes are higher, the competition fiercer, and the rewards greater than anything they have ever experienced. Training camps in the summer become laboratories of human performance, where coaches and players experiment with new techniques, new strategies, new ways of pushing the boundaries of what is possible. The heat and humidity of August afternoons become the crucible in which teams are forged, where individual talents are molded into collective units capable of achieving greatness. The preseason games are dress rehearsals for the drama to come, opportunities for coaches to test their theories and for players to prove their worth. The cuts that follow are among the most brutal moments in sports as dreams die and futures are determined by the smallest of margins. The men who survive become part of something larger than themselves, joining a brotherhood that extends back through generations of players who have worn the same uniforms and fought for the same goals. The regular season unfolds like a novel, with each game a new chapter in the larger story. The early games are filled with optimism and possibility, as every team believes it can be the one to reach the ultimate goal. The middle games test character and resolve, as injuries mount and weaknesses are exposed. The late games separate the contenders from the pretenders, as the pressure increases and the margin for error disappears. The playoffs are pure theater, with every game a potential ending to someone's season and someone's dreams. The intensity reaches levels that seem to transcend normal human experience, as players push themselves beyond their perceived limitations, and teams achieve things that seemed impossible just weeks before. The drama is heightened by the knowledge that every play could be decisive, every mistake could be fatal, every moment could be the one that determines who moves forward and who goes home. The Super Bowl remains the ultimate stage, the final act in the year-long drama that has captivated millions of Americans. It is more than just a football game. It is a cultural event, a shared experience that brings families and communities together in ways that few other things can. The players who reach this stage become part of history, their performances remembered and discussed for generations. In the end, football is a game of moments, the perfectly thrown pass that threads the needle between defenders, the bone-jarring hit that changes the momentum of a game, the spectacular catch that defies both gravity and logic. It is a game of seasons, the hope of training camp, the excitement of opening day, the drama of the playoffs, the finality of the Super Bowl. It is a game of generations, fathers passing their love of the game to their sons, players becoming coaches, legends becoming memories. The game has given us heroes and villains, champions and underdogs, moments of transcendence and examples of human frailty. It has shown us what is possible when talent meets opportunity, when preparation meets chance, when individual brilliance serves collective purpose. It has taught us about perseverance and teamwork, about the importance of both physical and mental toughness, about the value of dedication and the rewards of hard work. The heroes of the game come in all shapes and sizes, from all backgrounds and all walks of life. Some are blessed with extraordinary physical gifts that allow them to perform feats that seem to defy the laws of nature. Others succeed through intelligence, determination, and an unwillingness to accept defeat. Some become household names whose faces appear on magazine covers and television commercials. Others labor in relative obscurity, contributing to their team's success in ways that don't show up in statistics but are no less important. The villains are equally diverse. Players whose actions on or off the field have brought controversy to the game. Some are guilty of nothing more than playing with an intensity that crosses the line into dirty play. Others have made mistakes in their personal lives that have damaged their reputations and disappointed their fans. The game has always attracted strong personalities, and not all of those personalities have been admirable. The champions are remembered for their moments of glory, their ability to rise to the occasion when everything was on the line. They are the players who made the crucial catch, scored the winning touchdown, or delivered the bone-crushing hit that changed the course of a game. They are the teams that overcame adversity, that found ways to win when winning seemed impossible, that captured the imagination of fans and the respect of their opponents. The underdogs are equally beloved, the players and teams who succeeded despite being counted out, who proved that heart and determination can sometimes overcome superior talent and resources. They represent the best of what sports can offer, the proof that anything is possible if you're willing to work hard enough and never give up on your dreams. As the seasons continue to turn and the game continues to evolve, one thing remains constant: the magic that happens when the ball is snapped and the play begins. In that moment, all the analysis and statistics, all the money and media attention, all the politics and controversy fade away, leaving only the pure essence of competition. 22 men pursuing a single goal, using every ounce of skill and strength and intelligence they possess, creating moments of beauty and drama that will be remembered long after the final whistle has blown. The future of the game is being written by players who are still in high school, still dreaming of the day when they might step onto an NFL field and test themselves against the best in the world. They are practicing in small-town gyms and urban recreation centers, on college campuses and in professional training facilities, preparing for a future that they can only imagine but are determined to reach. The coaches of tomorrow are studying film in dimly lit offices, analyzing every detail of every play, searching for the insights that will give them an edge over their opponents. They are teachers and strategists, psychologists and motivators, men and women who understand that success in football requires more than just talent. It requires preparation, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. The fans of the future are growing up in a world where football is more accessible, more immediate, and more engaging than ever before. They are watching games on devices that didn't exist a decade ago, participating in fantasy leagues that span continents, and connecting with other fans in ways that were unimaginable to previous generations. They are the inheritors of a tradition that stretches back more than a century, and they will be the ones who determine what the game becomes in the decades to come. This is American football, not just a game, but a cultural phenomenon, not just a sport, but a way of life, not just entertainment, but a shared experience that brings millions of people together in common cause. It is violent and beautiful, simple and complex, ancient and modern, a perfect reflection of the country that created it and the people who love it. The future of the game remains unwritten, its next chapter waiting to be authored by players not yet born, coaches not yet dreamed of, fans not yet converted to its particular brand of controlled chaos. But whatever form it takes, whatever new innovations emerge, whatever new challenges it faces, the game will endure because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. The desire to compete, to excel, to push beyond the boundaries of what seems possible. The game will continue to change, as it always has, adapting to new technologies, new understanding of human performance, new social and cultural realities. The rules will be modified, the equipment will be improved, the strategies will become more sophisticated. But the essential character of the game will remain unchanged. It will still be about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the triumph of preparation over circumstance, about the beauty that can emerge from controlled violence. In the end, that may be football's greatest achievement. Not the money it generates or the entertainment it provides, but the way it continues to inspire us to reach for something greater than ourselves, to strive for excellence in all its forms, to never stop believing that the next play might be the one that changes everything. In a world that often seems divided and uncertain, football offers something rare and precious, a common language of competition and achievement, a shared understanding of what it means to give everything you have in pursuit of victory, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are won not by the strongest or the fastest, but by those who refuse to give up, who keep fighting until the final whistle blows, who understand that in the end the game is not just about winning or losing, but about the courage to compete, the wisdom to prepare, and the heart to never surrender. The lights will dim on stadiums across America, the crowds will go home, the players will retire, and the coaches will move on to other challenges. But the game will remain, passed down from generation to generation like a sacred trust, evolving and adapting, but never losing its essential character, never forgetting its roots in those muddy fields of the 19th century, where young men first discovered that, in the collision of bodies and the clash of wills, something magical could emerge, something that would capture the imagination of a nation and become as American as apple pie and the 4th of July. This is the story of American football, not just how it was played, but how it was lived, how it was loved, how it became woven into the very fabric of American life. It is a story that continues to unfold every autumn, in small towns and big cities, in high school stadiums and professional arenas, wherever 22 men take the field in pursuit of victory and the chance to add their own chapter to the greatest story ever told in the American sporting experience. The game awaits, as it always has, as it always will, ready to create new heroes and new legends, new moments of triumph, and new examples of what is possible when human beings push themselves to the very limits of their abilities. The next snap is coming, the next play is waiting, The next season is approaching. And somewhere in America, on a field bathed in autumn light, the game will continue, as it has for more than a century, as it will for centuries to come, a testament to the enduring power of competition, the beauty of athleticism, and the unbreakable bond between a nation and its most beloved game. The story is far from over. In practice facilities across the country, young men are preparing for careers that may take them to heights they can barely imagine. In draft rooms, scouts and coaches are evaluating talent that will shape the future of franchises for decades to come. In boardrooms, executives are making decisions that will determine how the game is played, watched, and experienced by future generations. The game will face new challenges, as it always has. Questions about player safety will continue to evolve as our understanding of injury and recovery advances. The role of technology in both playing and watching the game will continue to expand in ways we can't yet imagine. The global reach of the sport will present new opportunities and new complications as the game seeks to balance its American roots with its international aspirations. But through all these changes, the fundamental appeal of football will remain constant. There will always be something magical about watching 22 of the world's finest athletes test themselves against each other in a controlled environment where anything can happen. There will always be drama in the countdown of the game clock, beauty in the perfect spiral of a well-thrown pass, excitement in the explosive collision of irresistible force meeting immovable object. The game will continue to serve as a metaphor for American life itself, the importance of preparation, the value of teamwork, the rewards of perseverance, the reality that success requires both individual excellence and collective effort. It will continue to provide a common language that unites people across regional, cultural, and generational divides, creating shared experiences and shared memories that become part of the fabric of American culture. And in the quiet moments between seasons, when the stadiums are empty and the fields are covered with snow, the game will rest but never sleep, gathering strength for the battles to come, preparing for the next autumn when it will once again capture the hearts and minds of millions of Americans who understand that football is more than just a game. It is a celebration of everything that makes us human, everything that drives us to compete, everything that inspires us to believe that with enough effort and enough heart, any dream is possible. The long arc of American football stretches from those first tentative steps in New Brunswick to the gleaming stadiums of today, and it will continue to stretch forward into a future we can only imagine. But whatever that future holds, the game will endure, because it speaks to something timeless and universal in the human spirit, something that transcends the particulars of rules and equipment and strategy to touch the very essence of what it means to strive, to compete, to never give up in the face of overwhelming odds. This is the story, and the story never ends.